So thank you, and thank you for having me. I think it's really valuable to recognise that I came into post in June 2017. Police Scotland has a presumption policy which assumes that as soon as you're appointed into a post, you become an expert. So I am very grateful for those of you I have engaged with in my post so far. And I think what I would say is I bow to your superior knowledge on a practitioner level. What I can bring to the party is quite a wide exposure to policing and an understanding of how the police service works, as well as a really good understanding of partnership working, which is probably one of my most passionate areas of business. So today, I'm going to talk to you about ensuring people and communities are safe. I'm going to try and give you it from quite a practical level, try to help you understand from the police perspective and what it is we are trying to achieve alongside partners, because that's probably one of the most critical things. So I have 15 minutes to touch on this and cover Police Scotland's response. So what I've decided to do is focus it down somewhat to domestic abuse. Now, you might think that that is a very narrow topic. I would suggest that domestic abuse, as you know, touches all of our communities across Scotland. It touches very diverse communities. It affects all of society. And society actually must take responsibility for changing cultures and attitudes. I think as well, why would I single out domestic abuse is really important? I think quite often we think about domestic abuse in isolation as that physical confrontation between two parties, the fight in the house, the fallout. Actually, if you think about it, 33% of all Scotland's rapes are committed in domestic abuse setting. So that helps me focus why domestic abuse is such an important area of business, and it's a significant demand for Police Scotland, and we recognise that we cannot eradicate domestic abuse alone. One of the things I just want to touch on is just to ensure you understand the way in which we define domestic abuse. It's really important, and it is going to change going forward. Perhaps not the definition, but the definition involves the 5 areas. So physical, verbal, sexual, psychological, or financial abuse. Now that's outlined in the joint protocol with Crown Office Procurator Fiscal Service. It's agreed by partners, and it also includes moving ahead the new domestic abuse bill when we start to talk about controlling behaviours, and finally that recognition that domestic abuse is far more than just the fight in the house between two partners. It is controlling behaviour that affects every aspect of a person's life. It does differ to the definition in England and Wales. In England and Wales, as many of you will know, it's far wider. It includes familial abuse, so it can involve children, brothers, sisters, parents, etc. We believe in Scotland that this narrow approach to domestic abuse actually highlights the importance of what we're trying to achieve. It doesn't water it down. It allows us to focus on what is being delivered. And our strategic intent is to reduce the harm caused by domestic abuse and ultimately eradicate it from society. That's informed by a number of areas. Clearly our Equally Safe strategy and delivery plan, which we'll be attending the discussions next week, and which we are providing feedback on. It's informed by the Justice Strategy, our 2026 strategy, the joint protocol, our improvement plan, which we are working upon currently because we recognise Police Scotland, whilst I believe it's driven forward this area of business since Mr House first addressed it nationally, we still have quite a lot of work to do, and that includes partnerships. So we are driving that forward, and it is reflected in our annual police plan that this is one of our priorities. So I want to touch now a little bit about demand, and I notice you've got some figures in the pack. So Scottish Government and Police Scotland fell out slightly. We lost one incident. You'll see that Justice statistics were produced and are produced in your pack, which says there was 58,810 incidents. We think there's a bit of double counting, so we've got 58,809, and we're in dispute about it. But we'll try and resolve that situation. But regardless, do you know what we are talking about are reports which are made to the police. This number has been relatively static for the last 5 years. Now that's not something I'm particularly pleased about, in honesty, because we recognise that it's underreported. I would like to see that number rise, and as controversial and challenging as that might sound, I think that might begin to us as a society to reflect the truth of what's happening in the privacy of someone's own home. We know that 47% of incidents convert from an incident to a crime. So we know that where there's a sufficiency of evidence for calls which we are called to, we will at least record one crime. We know that 9% of all sexual crime in Scotland is attributed to domestic abuse. When you strip away some of the figures which are recorded for statistical purposes, such as curb crawling, intimate images of children, etc., you see in the domestic abuse environment that that number will increase significantly. And again, I touched on the fact that 33% of our rapes in Scotland occur in a domestic abuse setting. From a police perspective, 20% of our operational activity on the ground is directed towards domestic abuse. That is a conservative estimate. So we have calculated that using the time where an officer is dispatched to an incident to the time they clear. It doesn't include any of that time about court preparation. It doesn't include the really critical support of victims. It doesn't include the appearance at court. So it is significantly underestimated. We attend an incident every 9 minutes, which will feature probably in our domestic abuse festive campaign. Again, we know that it's far more prevalent than that. But on average, it takes 9 hours to deal with an incident. So you can write off 2 officers for the duration of their shift to deal with one domestic incident. That is a reflection of the seriousness Police Scotland takes in respect to domestic abuse, the thorough investigation which should be applied for every call-out. So we are not trying to reduce that. We would try to make that more efficient going forward. We know that 24% of all violent crime is attributed to domestic abuse and that 85% of incidents occur within the home. We also understand 6% occur in licensed premises. But if you just consider, the privacy, as you know, of your home where you expect to be safe, you expect to have a happy family life, that is debilitating for victims. Domestic homicides, 14% of our domestic homicides come from domestic abuse. 14% of all Scotland's homicides come from domestic abuse, and that is something we're looking to reduce as well. We know that it is under-recorded. So what about the impact? So these statistics, that is one thing. It's one thing for us to consider, but I don't think we can lose that human impact. So what we know is that 39% of victims have either tried to leave the relationship in the last 12 months, but only half have successfully managed to do so. We all know that that's an indicator of increased risk when a person is trying to cross the threshold and get out of an abusive relationship. We understand as well that 27% of our victims are living in fear, day-to-day fear not only for their own safety, but actually for their children's safety as well. And again, the impact on children cannot be underestimated. So what of the actual children themselves? So we understand that 42% of incidents involved couples who have children. Again, if you look beyond our statistics at the Scottish Crime and Justice Survey Partner Abuse module, we know that where children were present, 3/4 of them saw or heard the domestic abuse. That's unacceptable. And you can only imagine the debilitating effect that that has on children going forward. We also know that 3% of perpetrators have threatened to harm the child. Now, we don't believe that's with a malicious intent toward the child necessarily in all instances, but it is about leverage. It's about control of the victim, and children are suffering as a result. So we have to be mindful of that when we are policing domestic abuse. And we know that 11% of victims intimate child access issues. And again, that can be about leverage of control. So what does that tell us about the impact on victims? Effectively, many of these things are an indicator of heightened risk. So where we identify these factors, we work hard to put in place appropriate safety planning with the victims, and the third sector and other organisations are critical to that delivery. So cost. From a domestic abuse perspective, COSLA's 2009 report identified that £2.3 billion was spent on criminal justice, policing, social housing. The 2010 Save Lives report suggested that was £2.4 billion. What you've heard today is up to £4 billion in total. I think the point is we are all spending a lot of money on this area. We need to work more effectively as partners in line with the Christie principles, but we have to invest in the third sector. Third sector are critical to police success in this area as well. And of course, that figure doesn't estimate at all the potential of loss. You know, the lost potential that victims or their children will never be able to contribute to society until they become a survivor. So that is not a true reflection of the cost to society, in my opinion. So some risks and opportunities. What lies ahead? So we have some new legislation. Many of you will be aware of the Domestic Abuse Bill, which is going through Parliament just now at stage 2. Yesterday, Justice Committee took evidence on emergency barring orders. Where there was an insufficiency of evidence, we may look to exclude a perpetrator from their home in order to give a victim some safety, some breathing space. And that's something the committee is going to go and make a decision on shortly. Currently, when we're dealing with domestic abuse, we're dealing with it in an episodic manner, which brings with it inherent risk. So we are going to the incidents as we are called, and whilst we do try and step back and take cognizance of the whole circumstances, the framework of the legislation currently only affords us the opportunity to report instances of domestic abuse. The Domestic Abuse Bill will afford us an opportunity to address that. It will also give us some additional powers in respect of non-harassment orders, because we know that the courts are not significantly consistent in considering non-harassment orders. So the Domestic Abuse Bill will make that mandatory, that courts will both consider and apply their rationale for not applying a non-harassment order. We also know it will provide a statutory aggravation for offences involving children, and it will also prohibit accused from defending themselves in court, which is something we welcome for victims. Looking ahead, my personal opinion is we need to be a little bit more ambitious, and it's something I've been discussing with the Equally Safe team, but we need to start looking about how we can provide evidence in advance of a trial so that the victim does not have to sit in front of an accused person and give their story. That is a personal opinion. We also have the Abusive Behaviour Sexual Harm Scotland Act, which involves non-consensual sharing of indecent or intimate images, for which we've had our first conviction, and we've got a number of solved cases going through the courts just now. And of course as well we have the Criminal Justice Act. So it's going to be one of the biggest single changes to Scots law for the police in a generation at least, and it will give us slightly different powers in respect of liberating somebody on investigative liberation. Where we believe there is further inquiry to be made, we will be able to impose some conditions or exclude them from attending certain premises, which is something we would welcome. So what of barriers to reporting? So the police service has some way to go in this respect, and it is something which we are proactively tackling. We are trying to make ourselves as accessible as possible, but we rely on the confidence of the public. So that means we have to provide a consistent service every time. As soon as we provide a poor service, you will see that Police Scotland is subject to extreme media criticism, so we have to get it right every time. It is correct that we are subject to scrutiny, as every agency should, but we have to provide that consistency. Which concludes that point. So, since I got ahead of myself, what about our capability and capacity? So we have a 3-tier model. The first is set out in our local policing divisions, as you expect. That is where the majority of our operational staff sit. Around 11,000 operational police officers policing local authority areas every day. So in that local area, every officer is responsible for policing domestic abuse. They have probably the first and most important role in getting it right once we've had that initial contact. They know their communities, they should know their offenders, and they know the intelligence requirements in those areas. They have access to specialist resources and guidance, which I'll touch upon, but that is particularly important for national consistency. Beyond that, we have domestic abuse investigation units, and this starts to afford an escalation for local policing officers. Their job is really to address and tackle those high tariff perpetrators, provide frontline support, and bring some consistency to protracted investigations. They should also work locally with partners at MARAC and MATAC, which I'll touch upon shortly, to bring about that coordinated approach to policing. They are a critical part of the connection between local policing officers and the task force which sit above them. So that final tier of our approach is the task force. So the task force sits under my command. They are a small team of officers distributed across Scotland, recognising the geography of Scotland. We have 3 teams in the north and 1 in the east and west. Now, that is the team who target by any legitimate means the worst of the worst perpetrators, of which I'll talk about shortly. These are the people who for decades have made victims' lives difficult or horrific in many cases. We will not stop at current victims. We will look over the lifetime of a person's relationships to bring them to justice. They are a very proactive force to be reckoned, and we adopt techniques that are not suitable for discussion here. It was recognised in HMIC's report that the task force and our approach to this area was something that England and Wales could learn from, and that we are very proud of. Probably the most important bit, not just because Deborah is sitting in front of me and she's inspector, but the coordination unit to the right. The coordination unit are critical to this because they bring that national consistency. They're the glue which holds us together. They provide a consistent national policy. They provide one place for partners at a national level to come into, and they host and organise all of our national domestic abuse forums and working groups. They are a critical part of this. We, as a service, are quite proud of this model, and just by way of example, we have this case which is coming to sentence on the 30th of November, McTaggart case. The headline is quite sensational. It is from The Sun. 900 rapes. This is the type of person the task force are targeting, and we will be looking for an order of lifelong restriction on this person and hope that he will serve out the rest of his days in custody. He has carried out 3 decades of abuse on family members and members of his own community. So, further on capability and capacity, people are everything. We have to make sure our people are in the right place at the right time. They have the appropriate skills. We cannot eradicate domestic abuse alone, so that involves yourselves. And I guess what I would ask is, what are you doing to bring your people up to speed? What are you doing to ensure that CPD, the continuous professional development? We will try to do our bit, and it is my job to make sure those partnerships are working. Skills are critical. We all know if you don't use your skills, they're perishable. And actually, the reality for policing is technology is evolving at a pace we are really having to work hard to maintain, and that's reflected in our 2026 strategy. All of our domestic abuse can include online, but with the evolution of apps, Snapchat, it's probably 10 years out of date now, actually, showing my age, but all of these apps constantly evolve, and we need to bring our investigators up to speed in these areas. So one thing I'm passionate about is leadership. DCC Rose Fitzpatrick, who's pictured there, DCC Fitzpatrick and equally the other 2 DEPs, Mr Livingston and Mr Gwynn, are all really supportive. And I think that was set in stone by Mr House, in fairness to Sir Stephen. He has outlined the way in which Police Scotland will tackle this, and that leadership has continued. And even from a wider perspective, equality in the workplace, we have our Scottish Women's Development Forum, which DCC Fitzpatrick heads up. I think as an organisation, my line manager, Detective Chief Superintendent Bole, is really passionate and leads the way in this area. I think we are on the right tracks, but I would say there is much more to be done. From a learning perspective, it would be remiss of us to say that we know it all. We certainly don't. We get things wrong on occasion, but I think the focus has to shift from blame to learning. So one of our contributions, which will be taken forward to the Equally Safe Delivery Plan, will be to consider domestic homicide reviews. We currently carry them out for police cases only. We will look at our internal process. There is a discussion to be had about adopting a much wider approach. And we will have to break down those barriers of fear, if I'm honest. Nobody wants to be criticised, but to prevent the next homicide, we're going to have to learn. And we have to capture that, and we have to turn lessons identified into lessons learned. We're really good at identifying lessons, but actually can we say we've really learnt from them that is something I think we need to take forward. And from a futures perspective, 2026 is the way we are going. It's our 10-year strategy for policing in Scotland. We are actively looking at body-worn camera for all officers. It will be subject to public consultation. I don't think there's any state secrets in that respect. I think that has a lot to contribute in a domestic abuse setting. What you cannot portray in the form of a written word in a standard prosecution report to the Crown is that snidey look that a perpetrator fires to the victim as you approach, that a camera will capture. But perhaps the officers who are thinking about the safety of the victim, the safety of children, all of that white noise that is going on when we attend an incident, that immediate safety to them, because our officers are assaulted daily, that is not always picked up. If we have that captured on camera, it affords the court the opportunity to see that and actually examine the setting as it was at the time. We saw from Aberdeen trial that there was a guilty plea rate of 45% in advance of trial. With introduction of body-worn cameras in 2013, that rose to 91%. So, efficiencies aside, the cost of actually putting a victim in front of the court and making them recount their story, if we can replace that with evidence-led and get an early plea, that is a massive benefit to victims as well as the services. As well as that, we're probably going to look to tackle domestic abuse personal alarms. There are different models in place across the country, and we have recently bid for some funding to try and address that from a police perspective. We are hopeful that that will provide a national alarm solution for Scotland, which will harness all of the new technologies available to keep people safe. So finally, partnerships, or almost finally, don't want to get your hopes up, sorry. Partnerships are critical. It's one of our 7 strategic police priorities, collaborative working. It picks up the Christie principles, and these are some of the examples that we would use. So DSDAS, the Disclosure Scheme for Domestic Abuse Scotland, has just reached its 2nd anniversary. In the 3rd year, we're looking to evaluate its effectiveness to see how much it has informed victims and actually given them back the power to make decisions about their lives. What I would say is it has 2 parts, as many of you probably know, the power to tell and the right to ask. We have an opportunity where we know there is a domestic abuse, a perspective to a relationship, to step forward, to submit a proposal to a national decision-making forum and to give the victim the power to make a decision. We can do that. They do not have to apply themselves. That is really important, and is a message I would like you to take away and consider. We have the joint protocol with Crown Office, Procurator Fiscal Service, which, if you're following the media, is coming under a bit of scrutiny from BBC Today around our use of undertakings. That is something which underwent significant consultation with partners and has been agreed nationally, and which we continue to be supportive of. We also have MARAC, where there is a victim focus, where we look to bring the victim into safety, and MATAC, which is perpetrator focused. MATAC is unique to Scotland and is something we'll be doing a webinar, which will be another new experience, with England and Wales shortly to see if they want to adopt that model. It's perpetrator focused. It looks to bring those who are abusing victims to justice by whatever means. So finally, we do contribute to Equally Safe. We have an active part, but we are only one of many players in that role. We will continue to focus on prevention. Bearing in mind this takes 20% of police time, I think we need to focus our activity as much on prevention as primary prevention as secondary and tertiary prevention. MARACs are probably critical to that going forward, and we need to get a national standard, which I know Save Lives and Scottish Government are working towards. Interventions remain key. I think the public, if I'm honest, are guilty sometimes of seeing the police as the traditional crime fighters. The reality of the demand on Police Scotland is unbelievable. Some of the nature of the calls in which we receive requests for assistance, you would probably be astonished. We are expected to be everything to everybody, But this is one area of business we cannot let slip. We need to keep our interventions ongoing with perpetrators to keep victims safe, but I would rather that shifted more towards primary prevention. And finally, with perpetrators, we will continue to hold them account through each of our tiers of policing response, and ultimately the task force, who will continue to tackle the worst of the worst. And by way of some sense of what they achieve this year alone, the small team have targeted, I think, 33 high-risk perpetrators who received 136 years of imprisonment, and we have several cases which are coming to court for sentencing in the next month. McTaggart is one of which will appear on the 30th. Moving forward, we have to tackle all of these areas to deliver the police service's ultimate aim, which is continued excellence in service and protection. Thank you.